Are you strategic? The answer can make or break your business. Welcome to Strategic Minds, the podcast where we'll do a deep dive in conversations with extraordinary leaders to learn how they think, plan, and act strategically. I'm your host, Rich Horwath, founder of the Strategic Thinking Institute and author of the book Strategic, and my vision is to teach the world to think strategically. Now, let's explore Strategic Minds.
We're stuck.
What do we do? I have no idea.
You need a new strategy.
We need a more dynamic strategy.
The strategy?
You have to strategize.
But you won't strategize.
Let's talk a little strategy.
Welcome to Strategic Minds. Today on the show, I'm excited to speak with pioneering neurosurgeon, Dr. Ted Schwartz. He's published over 500 scientific articles and chapters on neurosurgery and has lectured around the world, from Bogota to Vienna to Mumbai, on new minimally invasive surgical techniques that he has helped develop. Ted also runs a basic science laboratory devoted to epilepsy research and recently published a fantastic new book that I highly recommend entitled Gray Matters, a biography of brain surgery. Ted, thank you for being on the show.
Rich, it's really a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Sure. In the book, you do a wonderful job describing your background, and I'd love for you to share with our audience a little bit about your origin story, where you grew up, and how that environment and the people there shaped who you are today.
So I grew up in Manhattan, New York City, in the thick of it, and my father was a Freudian psychoanalyst. So he was a very intellectual, academic kind of guy. He would spend his weekends listening to opera and rereading the collected works of Freud and Shakespeare and taking me to like foreign films where no one spoke a word of English and I had to read subtitles, which at age, 8 to 10 is really not that much fun, but I'm sure I learned something from it. And my mother was a Holocaust survivor and was born in Austria and hid during the war in Belgium in a convent. And so I had a unique upbringing. She was very European at heart. I used to joke with my friends, most people in America have salad with their dinner. We would have salad like at the end of the meal. Like there were some weird things that she would do that made no sense to me. Or sometimes my friends would talk to me and say, they would do imitations of my mother's accent because she had sort of this strong Viennese accent. I never heard it. I thought she spoke perfect English, because I was raised hearing her voice. And I always thought that was really interesting. But those two elements definitely led me to be, on the one hand, very curious about the brain and the mind, how the brain and the mind interact, human motivations. But also, my mother used to say she had a suitcase packed under her bed. And at any moment, she was ready to just get up and move. Like she knew that she was never fully comfortable wherever she was. Unlike most of us in America who grow up very comfortable and we're lucky where we live, she did not grow up that way. And I think that lent an air of not being complacent at any point in my life and always feeling like I didn't deserve anything, but I had to work for everything and constantly prove myself, as I did with my father, constantly prove myself intellectually to him. And I used to kind of spar with him intellectually as children do, some kind of an Oedipal friction, but it was a very loving relationship, and it was a great upbringing. But so I also played sports. I played on the football team. I was a musician. I loved the bass guitar, and I played in the jazz band. And I was a kid who just liked to have a lot of activities. I had a lot of friends. I used to like to, engage with people and focus and practice and express myself through music. And then was lucky enough to go to Harvard, where I studied philosophy and English. And I think that was part of my literary background, was all those years just reading and thinking, squirreled away in libraries, and then ultimately made the decision to go into medicine, not to become a neurosurgeon per se, but because I really felt that I was happiest with a life dedicated to helping other people, and I really kind of wanted to make a difference in the world.
Excellent. That's a great overview, Ted. I really appreciate that. You mentioned jazz, and one of the things in the book you talk a little bit about jazz and some of the classical and some of those other musical genres. And I'd be interested, we think about those types of musicians. Many people are familiar with the 10,000 hour rule. Malcolm Gladwell popularized it. It was the research of Anders Ericsson out of Florida State and he studied musicians, and you need 10,000 hours to reach this expert level. When we think about preparation as a neurosurgeon, maybe you can walk us a little bit through how you prepared and what that looked like from a preparation standpoint to be in a position where you've literally have someone's life in your hands.
Yeah, I think, two of the experiences I had as a child that helped me with preparation in neurosurgery. One was probably playing high school football, first of all, because this was this sense of, being part of a team, going to practice every day, working hard for your position, struggling with a group of people to try to achieve something. I just think it built my character in a way. But then musician was a big part of it. And I'm a guy who could sit in a room and practice scales and arpeggios and work on learning a new piece for hours and hours and hours at a time. And I think that lent itself to brain surgery. So just to skip to what it's like to prepare for brain surgery, when we're doing surgery on someone else's brain who, let's say, has a tumor, they come to you with a problem that needs to be fixed. And they're basically, for a period of time, handing you their most precious possession, which is their brain, and relying on you to make sure that they come through this operation as well as they possibly can, knowing that there are real risks that things can go wrong, and that in your hands, you potentially can alter their lives for the negative as well as for the positive. And most of the times it is for the positive, and we mostly help people. But it's an enormous amount of responsibility. And so when we're preparing for these operations, and just to kind of set that stage, brain tumors can be deep, deep in the brain. And in order to get to them can take 1, 2, sometimes 3 hours just to get to the tumor. You have to go through the scalp, you have to go through the skull, you have to plan what your trajectory is going to be to approach the tumor. And tumors can be anywhere in the brain. And depending on where they are, you have to conceive of an approach that's going to get you there safely. And there's a million little landmines in your way that you have to avoid. And you know where those things are. So you look at an MRI scan, which is essentially a 2-dimensional representation of the anatomy of the brain and the tumor. And then in your head, you have to create a 3D representation of what it's going to look like. You have to imagine what it's going to be like when I go there from this angle, from this angle, from this angle, and kind of run through all the different possibilities, which the better you get at it, the more quickly you do that. And you say, all right, this is going to be the best approach for me to do this. So I'm going to have to start with an incision in this particular location, and I'm going to have to go through this particular area to get there. And these surgeries are done under a microscope. And so we're often sitting, in a special chair that supports your arms so that you don't have any tremor. And your hands are making these tiny, tiny little moves, working instruments that are, 7 or 8 centimeters long, which is about, 5 or 6 inches long, the tips of which are remarkably thin and tiny. So you can barely see them with the naked eye, which is why we're using these microscopes to operate. And you're manipulating little blood vessels and little nerves, and you're carefully dissecting them off tumors. And so in order to make sure that you're going to be properly prepared for that, there's a process of mental repetition, and rehearsal that you go through before every operation. And of course, the more you've done it, the more quickly you can do that. And sometimes it even occurs without even consciously doing it. You're running through it, but it's almost like it's running through you, if you will, because you're just sort of going from option 1 to option 2 to option 3 to come up with a plan of attack. And what often happens is when you get in there, what you find could be a bit different than what you imagined, right? Because reality is never quite as you imagine it. And the information we have going into a brain surgery is imperfect. We're always making decisions. We don't have 100% of the information. We have as much as we can get, but it's imperfect. Our representations of what we're going to encounter is imperfect. So you have to change from plan A to plan B, and from plan B to plan C. And you're constantly altering what you're going to do and interacting with the brain's anatomy in order to get the job done. But it's this constant iterative practice of trying something, seeing how it goes. If it goes well, you keep going. If you're impaired, there's an impediment ahead of you, you then, jigger to the left and try something else and try something else, try a different instrument until finally, over time, you make that progress, and the surgery kind of evolves, it flows, it unfolds in a pattern that's very hard to predict beforehand. And it's almost, I often say to the residents when we're operating, I'm saying, don't forget to listen to the tumor. And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, you have to listen to the tumor. The tumor is telling you where it's going to hold on and where it's going to let you go. And you can't always impose your will on the tumor, but you have to listen to it and see what it's telling you and react to that to change your plan. So you have to be receptive to the information coming in order to create the most productive plan to move forward.
Yeah, that's a really powerful concept that you just shared, the listen to the tumor. And as I think about a lot of the business leaders out there, I'm thinking about, the problems, challenges that business leaders face. And sometimes, to your point, being too stringent, being too carved in stone with here's the plan, we're just going to keep hammering away at this plan, instead of listening to customers, listening to the problems, listening to the situations that are evolving. So I really like that approach of listening to the tumor, being sensitive to what you're seeing there. You described a lot of interesting things there, and I want to dive a little deeper into the time piece. In the book, you talk about a lot of these surgeries typically taking 4 to 6 hours, some of the more extensive, complicated ones taking many more hours than that. When you think about that, and I know in the book too, you do a great job in the book, by the way, of interweaving your personal approach with basically that historical perspective of neurosurgery, which I found really intriguing. And one of the things you talk about for yourself is, popping up, waking up at 4 a.m. in the bed, just sleeping, thinking about, the procedure, what's going to happen, those types of things. Do you have any tips for leaders out there on the way that you manage your energy, your concentration for such extended periods of time where you really have to focus and be it really in the moment from a flow standpoint?
Well, one thing has to do with routine, right? You have to know your body and know your body's routine. So I know when I have to go to bed at night. I have the same breakfast every single morning. When I'm driving to work, I have the same protein shake and the same protein bar. And I also know when I need to go to the bathroom, right? Before I am, heading into the operating room, it's almost unconscious of me to just sort of say, hey, let's go to the bathroom now so that I don't have to go to the bathroom in the middle of the operation. And so I go through the same routine every time in terms of when I round on my patients, how I schedule my day. Each day is a little different, but I try to organize it in a very similar way. My diet is very regulated. I know what I can have for dinner. I mean, I'm not drinking alcohol during the week, because I want to be functioning at 100%. I mean, you need to show up every day that you're doing brain surgery and be working at 100%. And the question is, how do you put yourself in that mental space and in that physical space to function at 100%? Literally 3 days a week I'm operating, 48 weeks a year, going on 25 years, right? I mean, it's relentless. It's every day you have to show up because you have to be there for your patient. And the truth is, what you're deathly afraid of is failure, right? You're deathly afraid of, God forbid, something goes wrong. The emotional weight that we have to deal with when something has not turned out the way you planned and the way the patient expected it to be, that emotion is something that you definitely want to avoid and pushes you to be so regimented with your schedule because that you have to be your best every single time.
Yeah, thanks, Ted. That's a really important point, I think, for a lot of the leaders out there. Is you talked about that 100% commitment to being prepared for that day for the patient, and I think in business we've got to be honest with ourselves. Are we really bringing 100% focus, discipline? I love the fact that you just laid out your schedule and what you do from a routine perspective. And again, that may not be easy, but it's what you've determined is going to drive your success. So I would
The
definitely
other things,
encourage yeah.
I exercise on Tuesdays, Fridays, Saturdays, Sundays. Those are my non-OR days. I exercise, and when I'm exercising and I'm working my core, a lot of the time, I'm thinking about the patients that I have to operate on, because I know that, come 3-4 hours into an operation, the better shape I'm in, the less my back is going to hurt, the less my shoulder is going to hurt, the more I'm going to be able to physically be able to do what I need to do. But I also know that if I exercise on the days that I operate, you can have a tremor. Like if you're lifting weights, if you're straining your muscles, later on that day, your fine movements, it's like an athlete. You don't work out on the day of the game. You work out on the other days, right? So I also work out on very specific days of the week to make sure that on the OR days, that is the only thing that I'm doing physically. But on the other days, I'm preparing for those OR days by strengthening my core, strengthening my neck. There's so many surgeons who have neck operations because they spend hours and hours and hours with their head leaning forward with, loops on and headlights on, and they end up herniated discs in their neck. And so I'm also focusing on the physical.
Yeah, in that holistic approach, I'd like to get into that a little bit more. In the book, you talk about the idea of perfectionism, and you do a great job citing other leaders in the field. Dr. Harvey Cushing was one, and you describe, his personality type and that perfectionism that drove him. You talk about other neurosurgeons, yourself. Maybe you can share a little bit on that idea of perfectionism. It gets a lot of play in the media today, and in people talking about the positives of it and maybe sometimes the downsides of it. What's your perspective on perfectionism?
So a couple of comments on that. First, Harvey Cushing, who was someone who took neurosurgery, really he's the forefather of neurosurgery, for those who don't know. Before Harvey Cushing, there was no surgeon who specialized just in neurosurgery. Just general surgeons would do it. And because the mortality rate was about 50%. So half the patients that they operated on would die either as a result of the surgery or soon after. And by the end of his career, the mortality was 8%. So he took neurosurgery from a field that essentially nobody wanted to do because it was unsafe. But you can imagine how difficult it must have been for him at the beginning to lose patient after patient after patient and to come back and say, I need to do better. I need to do better. I need to do better. Now, the cost of that was that he wasn't a particularly good husband. He wasn't a great father. There's a very famous story when his one of his sons, who had finished his junior year at Yale, was out celebrating on a Friday night and got into a car accident and died tragically. And Harvey Cushing was notified of this Saturday morning, and he had an operation scheduled. So someone came to him. He was on his way to the OR, and they said, "Listen, your son just died. We need someone to go collect the body." And rather than say, okay, let's cancel the operation because I need to be there for my wife, who's obviously going to grieve, and I need to go out and grieve for my son, he went in and he did his operation. And only after the operation was done did he go to collect his son's body. And there I tell stories about other surgeons who have had that kind of dedication and perfectionism. And so one of the hard things about being a perfectionist is what's the cost? Because none of us can be perfectionist. We cannot be perfect. Even Harvey Cushing at the end of his career was still losing 8% of his patients, even though he had made remarkable progress. We cannot be perfect. And one of the things I struggle with because I am always trying to achieve perfection, and every operation, I'm always doing a debrief, mostly with myself, but also with my fellow, if something doesn't go perfectly. And I say, all right, what could we have done better here? How can we change what we do to try to do it better next time? What did we miss? And that's often very hard to do in brain surgery because you're handed down how to do brain surgery. We learn it like an apprentice from a master. So there's a master teaching you what to do, who learned it from their master. And it goes back, for 100 years of neurosurgery. And to think that you may have the audacity to improve on something that you were taught is very, very challenging because,
Sure.
You were preceded by these brilliant, hardworking people who created this craft. Who am I to think I can actually do it better? So we're constantly trying to change what we do. But what I try to ask myself at the end of the operation with my perfectionism is, if the result wasn't perfect, did I do the best that I could? Did I get a good night's sleep? Did I eat everything? Did I think about this operation in the right way? Or was I trying to cut corners? was something else on my mind. And if I can say to myself, you know what, you did everything you could, you did the best job you could, and yes, it didn't go perfectly, but it wasn't because you didn't try your hardest, then that makes me feel a little bit better. Obviously, every once in a while, it's like, you know what, you cut a corner here. You shouldn't have done that, and that's the hardest part, because then that it was because of an absence in you, a lack in you, that there was a problem. And so that's why you become so regimented the next time, because you're like, whatever happens, I don't want it to be that I did not do my very best job, because that's the only way I can live with myself.
Yeah, that focus on process, I think, is another great takeaway for a lot of business leaders out there. In what you described, I know in the military, oftentimes is similar to an after-action review, where they really look at what happened, why did it happen? To your point, what could we do better? One of the things you talk about in the book, which I found fascinating, was just the decision making that has to happen. I wondered, Ted, if you could share with us maybe some of the decision making principles that you use, because obviously you're making very high stakes decision, much higher stakes than we are in business typically, because you have people's life in your hands. Any decision making principles that you use when it comes to making decisions during your procedures?
One of the points I make in the book about decision making is that I use the analogy of a baseball player who's trying to steal second base, which is something we can all relate to. Because, when you're deciding, if that baseball player is deciding whether to steal, there's some things that they can measure and some things that they can't measure. They may know whether the pitcher has a strong arm or not, or the catcher has a strong arm or not. They can tell you what the field conditions are like. But sometimes the decisions we make are based on a lot of intangible things. Like the last time I tried to steal second base, was I successful? Was I, out, or did I make it? And if I was unsuccessful last time, I might be less likely to do it again. Or is my coach telling me I need to steal more bases? So maybe I'm going to push myself to steal more bases. And we don't like to think that neurosurgeons are impacted by decisions like that as well, but we're human beings like everyone else. And a lot of the times we'll make decisions that will be influenced by factors that, if you study behavioral economics, or things that we kind of can't control in the human brain that push us and bias us in one way or another. And it's very important to be aware of those things, because sometimes my gut, God forbid I had a complication doing a particular approach one day, and a similar patient comes in, I may second guess, like, well, what's the right thing to do for this patient? It was so horrible what I went through last time when it didn't work out. Should I stop doing that? Or were there factors going on at that moment in time that I can control and change and do a better job this time? And so there's a lot of soul searching that goes on in terms of trying to make that proper decision, when you find yourself in a circumstance that maybe didn't go perfectly the last time, because our human nature is kind of to avoid putting yourself in that circumstance again. But in brain surgery, it's very hard to do that, because, the patients come in and you need to keep taking care of them. And so I think what I try to do is try to be as objective as I can. And only by trying to really understand what the cause of the problem was that I may have faced beforehand, can I figure out what the best way forward is. Because if you're not really sure why something went wrong, then it's very hard to do it again. Because, doing it again and getting the same result again and again and again, if it's a bad result, you're going to kick yourself and say, well, why did I try to do this again if I couldn't figure out what went wrong? So that's why that process of review and internal review and analysis is so important, to make sure that going forward, you're still making the best decisions for all your patients.
And are those things that you just described things that you were shared with you when you were apprenticing, or is that something that you just absorbed through more informal ways from an observation perspective?
I don't think these things are taught, in medicine. They're not really taught. What's unusual in neurosurgery is it's really not a team sport. You are there by yourself. You're alone. There's nobody in the operating room looking over your shoulder. There's nobody who knows. And by the way, every neurosurgical operation, we're making 1,000 small decisions. And nobody is reviewing each one of those decisions and saying, like, that's moronic, or that's idiotic. Why are you doing that? Which is why, by the way, I like to train fellows. I like to have fellows who've trained at other programs to come because they operate with you, and you kind of sometimes I'll learn from them. Sometimes they'll show me a trick that another surgeon's doing at another institution that I just was never taught and never exposed to. Because you can imagine this: when I trained, right? I trained at a neurosurgical program. Every program has maybe 10 neurosurgeons who are operating. So I'm learning from 10 people. That's it. Of the 5,000 neurosurgeons in the United States that I could learn from, I'm only learning from 10 of them. And they learned from a limited number. And if you go back a couple of decades, there were maybe 2 or 3 neurosurgeons operating. And so you would only learn from a very limited number of people how to do what we do. And you miss out from all the techniques that are proliferating around the country at other institutions. And so I love having fellows come in to operate with me, and I'm there ostensibly to teach them. But I always pick up a couple of tricks from them because you have to be sort of humble and realize that, like, hey, maybe I can learn something from this guy or this woman to be better.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, I love that idea of getting different perspectives, different ideas from other areas. I think in business, it's important too. Sometimes we're so focused on our industry that we can borrow ideas and concepts and business models from other industries, and if we're open to that, as you are. So that's a great piece of
another
advice.
great example of that is some of the surgeries I learned how to do called craniotomies, where you open up the side of the head and you sort of dismantle the muscles and you elevate the brain out of the way to get to deep tumors. Neurosurgeons started to collaborate with other surgeons, namely surgeons who operate up the nose with endoscopes. So we're learning from another field. And now we realized we can go up the nose with endoscopes and take out these tumors at the base of the brain, underneath the brain. But it's only because we collaborated with other surgeons who had another expertise that we were really not very good at. And the same thing with now I've started to do surgery where I make a small incision in the eyelid and work around the orbit to take out brain tumors, which I never learned how to do. And neurosurgeons didn't do that operation, but we started collaborating with oculoplastic surgeons and realized that we could leverage their expertise, use what they know to help us get to the brain in more refined and direct manners that could be less damaging to the normal brain structures.
Yeah, you do a wonderful job in the prologue of really drawing readers into that procedure you talked about, going through the eyelid. I'd be interested, Ted, when you think back to that first time you did it, what was and you were obviously learning from other surgeons or physicians how to do that part. Was there anything from a preparation standpoint that went into it? Because I would think there's both the technical piece and then that emotional piece of, maybe not having a big body of confidence in that area because you hadn't done it before. What was your prep like for a completely new procedure all the way, into your career at this point?
Yeah, the hardest part was the philosophical leap of faith to realize that it could be done. And honestly, I never imagined I could take out brain tumors through the eyelid. I didn't think there'd be enough room between the eyeball and the eye socket. Like you don't think there's a lot of room in there. And I've studied anatomy and I still didn't think there was enough room to work. I had to go to Korea, South Korea, and watch another neurosurgeon do it and see that it could actually be done before I believed it. And once I saw that, then you can practice, right? We can practice on cadaver heads. You can have those kinds of opportunities. You can collaborate with other eye surgeons who can help you do it. But it's sort of that sense, if one man can do it, anyone can do it. If one person can do it, anyone can do it, is very true. Like what you have to see that it's doable. And then philosophically, you can say, yeah, this is doable. I can imagine it. But then you have to practice it. And you have to figure out what tools do I need to get this job done? What am I going to see when I go in there? Because I'm now seeing the brain and the skull from a completely different perspective that I've never seen it from before. So I need to get a sense of what that's going to be, what the structures are going to be. It's that, that 3D imagination that you have to create in your head of what you're going to go through when you're doing something for the first time. You don't really know what to expect. And so you read papers, you try to download as many images from people who maybe have done it before. You look at videos until it starts to make sense. But when you're one of the first to do it, there's not a lot out there. So at some point you have to bite the bullet and just, leap in there once you've made that philosophical decision that, yes, this makes sense and it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great example of innovation from a surgical perspective. As you think about other ways to innovate, Ted, are you intentionally, you talked about the neurosurgeon in South Korea and being able to go there and watch that procedure. Are you trained to intentionally look for new ways, different ways, or do they typically, do those things just kind of percolate up through your experience and your interactions with other people? Or is that more of an intentional, I'm going to go seek out different ways to try this?
We have literature. We have journals, right, where papers are published that where people introduce new techniques that they're trying. We have national meetings that we go to that people present their data, their series, their ways of doing things. And so we're constantly exposed to other people's ideas. That's how medicine progresses. The question is, do you look upon those other techniques as advances or as gimmicks? Do you imagine that the way you're doing it is the best way to do it? Or are you looking at them saying, maybe I'm going to learn something better so that I can make myself better? Or do you say, you know what, the way I'm doing it is perfectly fine. My patients do well. They do good enough. This is the way I was trained. So the exposure are all around us. It's everywhere around us are new ideas. The question is, are you open to embracing them? And are you willing to change, to embrace new ideas and to see the value in them? Or are you going to be skeptical and dogmatic and just say, you know what, it's too much of a hassle to try this new technique. It's too dangerous. And by the way, the idea of trying something new on a patient is terrifying because all we want to do is help people. And we don't want to experiment. We want to know that the outcome is as good as it's going to be, because the emotional ramification of hurting another human being is profound. It is profound. And there are very few professions out there where every day you come into work with a small chance that you may hurt another human being's life, even though you desperately just want to help them. That's why we went into this career, is we just want to help people. And most of the time you do. Don't get me wrong, neurosurgery is extremely safe and we help 99% of the people we operate on. But every once in a while, when things don't go well, it is a very, very psychologically challenging, difficult process of dealing with that and seeing that person, every day that potentially is, whose life you have damaged in some way. And the funny thing is, like, all the great moments are incredible, and the highs are as high as they can be when you come out of the operating room and you go into the waiting room and the family is there, on edge, not knowing whether their loved one is going to be okay or not. And you come out and you say, you know what, everything went great. Your loved one is going to be fine. And they literally will burst into tears. They'll throw their arms around you and give you a hug. So, the highs are all there, and that's what feeds us and keeps us going. But every once in a while, you have to deal with the low and you have to come back from it. And that's the hard part, is to come back from your failures, which can be so profound.
Yeah, and I would love to dive into that a little deeper too, because I know business leaders oftentimes are, fearful of making mistakes that could influence the livelihoods, the careers of hundreds, thousands of people. But again, it's a different perspective. They're not, to your point, they're not going to necessarily have someone's life in their hands. How do you then, Ted, deal with what you just described? How do you build up that emotional resilience, let's say, because there potentially could be non-optimal outcomes that happen?
There was a great book I read by a neurosurgeon named Jody Stern, who wrote about emotional armor and emotional flexibility. And what's really difficult is to go from one to the other, because you can build up emotional armor, but then you become not a human being, and if you're too emotionally flexible and open, you will collapse in tears, with everything that hits you the wrong way. And so the hard part is to be flexible, to be able to go back and forth. So we have to have the armor to move on when something doesn't go perfectly. Because we could do an operation in the morning that has a bad outcome and then have to go right back into the operating room in the afternoon and do our very best and want that best outcome. You can't let that morning experience affect your afternoon operation. And so you do have to be able to erect emotional armor when you're in the operating room. You have to forget who you're operating on. Sometimes you almost, try to block out the fact that it's a human being, but then there are moments where you have to bring that back in. Like there'll be moments in an operation where I'll be taking out a tumor, it'll be going great, and then I'll realize that part of the tumor is really stuck to something. And I'll step back for a second. I'll be like, all right, how old is this person? What do they do for a living? What would I want this done if this were me? And then I might say, you know what? I'm done. Like, I'm not going to try to push it. I'm not going to try to take out that last bit of tumor because we can treat it another way and it's not worth the risk. And so there's, that element of needing to take a step back and always remember who you're operating on, what you're doing, what are the goals of surgery. And then, of course, although we erect a certain amount of emotional armor to deal when things go wrong, you then have to also be very, very sensitive and be able to let down that armor and be a human being so that you can be compassionate, with the people you're taking care of, and that you can be sensitive to their needs. And it is a bit of a juggling act to have to go back and forth. Then, of course, you go home and, your daughter or your son is there and they just want a kind word said and help with their homework. And, you can't just go home and kick the dog because you're frustrated. So, but, this is stuff we all deal with every day. Like that's not unique to me in any way. We all have to have that flexibility to be who we need to be in the moment.
Yeah, and to build on that, you talk a little bit about compartmentalization, and I'm just in talking about going home, with your children. How do you compartmentalize what you're doing at work, and then coming home and being a good father, being a good husband?
One of the things I did, because there are sacrifices in becoming a neurosurgeon. There are, you can't go to all of your kids' sports. My son played on the tennis team, and his games were at 3:30 after school. And the only game I went to was his senior year last game because I had an operation that was canceled, and I went to one of his tennis matches. On the other hand, his hockey games were at 7 o'clock at night, and I went to almost all of them, or they were on the weekends, right? So the issue is, first of all, you can't make it to everything, but you have to make it to enough. You can't make it. It's not acceptable to make it to nothing, even though you can't make it to everything. You have to give your kids enough so they know you're there and you love them and you care about them. But the other thing that I did was I brought all of my kids into the operating room at a very young age. On a Saturday night when there was not a lot of people in the hospital, I would get called in to do an emergency surgery and I would be like, hey, why don't you come with me? And I would just park them in the corner of the operating room and they would see what I did, and they would see me talk to the families afterwards. And they would see, as time went on, friends of theirs whose parents had problems that I would help them with. And they began to understand that the work I was doing was very important. And even though it would take me away from them from time to time, they knew that it was something that they knew why I was doing it. You know what I mean? And so it was something we did together. Like they were almost saying, like, Dad, I want you to miss this thing because you need to take care of this person. It was important to them that I did the work that I did. So I tried to bring them into my world, as opposed to exclude them and not talk about it with them, so that they understood, almost like we were in it together.
Yeah, I love that concept, and I think giving people the why, and then to your point, showing them the why. Why are you here? Why aren't you here? I think even as business leaders, we can adopt a lot of that principle with the folks that we lead, giving them the why for situations, showing them different situations, whether it be with customers, with the board of directors, giving them those experiences. So I appreciate you sharing that. I think that's a powerful piece. Ted, one of the things you talk about in the book I found interesting too was the idea of confidence. And, we think about confidence and you look at some of the psychological studies, confidence is something that can ebb and flow, even for the people that are the most accomplished in their field. How would you describe your approach to growing confidence, maintaining confidence, to your point earlier, even when maybe outcomes in the past with a certain procedure haven't been as favorable? How do you grow? How do you nurture that confidence to be the best that you can be?
When a patient comes in to a neurosurgeon's office with a neurosurgical problem, you have to convince them that you are the best person to handle that problem. And you have to convince yourself, right? Because that you're the best person. So you have to be that. You have to be the best person, right? So you have to make yourself the best person and have that. So you don't want to inflate yourself into something that you're not. So you have to put in the work, and it definitely takes time to be able to exude, confidence, but not cross the line to arrogance. That's also because patients will pick up on that very, very quickly. And so what I try to do is just be very honest. You say, look, you can tell, say, I've done this X many times before. This is what I do. I'm very experienced in this. But I'll also say, I wish I could tell you that you're going to have, with 100% certainty, you're going to have a perfect outcome, but I can't. I could tell you 99%, 98% that this is going to go well. But there's a 1, 2, 3% chance that something could happen. And those are just the numbers. Like, those are the numbers published in every neurosurgical paper ever. We know that. And I try to be very forthright with my patients about that. And we may talk about risk and, handling risk and balancing risk. But very often they're in a situation, let's say they come to me with a tumor that's pushing on their optic nerves and they're slowly losing vision. Their vision's just a little bit worse in one eye, but they can still see. And I say, look, if we do nothing, there's a 100% chance that you're going to lose vision in your right eye. It may take 10 years, it may take 5 years, it may take 15 years, but it's going to happen. If I do surgery on you, maybe there's a 5% chance that your vision is going to be worse, but there's about a 95% chance it's going to be the same or better, and the tumor is going to be gone. So you'll have that for the rest of your life. And so we have to balance the risk of doing something versus the risk of not doing something, and realize, how to weigh those risks. And it can be a very, very difficult decision for them to make because, and for me to make, because I don't want to be the one to take their vision. I want to be the one to take the tumor out and keep their vision perfect. And I will be that person 95, 98% of the time, and we will all go home happy. But again, 2, 3, 4% of the time, I'm the one who makes their vision worse, not the tumor. And that's a very difficult situation for the patient-doctor relationship, for the doctor-doctor relationship, your confidence, keeping your confidence up. The next patient comes into your office and you have to jump right back in and say, I know I can do this operation.
Yeah, no, I think that's really well said. And I want to tie this back to something you said earlier. You talked about, being a mentor, to fellows that come in to work with you. And you described some really touching moments in the book where other surgeons, yourself, had issues that didn't go well. Is there anything that you do or would recommend as you're working with a fellow and maybe something they didn't go well? How do you, and maybe it's also part of the surgical team that you're with, how do you help other people stay confident, build confidence, especially when things didn't go well, maybe because of something they did? Is there anything that you do advice-wise there?
There's a famous saying, a very famous neurosurgeon who was asked, how did you become so great at what you do? And he answered, well, there's a graveyard full of my mistakes out in the back of the hospital, which is a little bit dramatic. But, what I try to tell fellows when things don't go great is that, look, this is part of neurosurgery. This is part of brain surgery. It's not always, you're not always going to make the basket, at the buzzer. I don't know who it was. Michael Jordan said, look, I missed the basket like, many, many, many times. I didn't make them all. I probably missed more than I made, and that's true of brain surgery as well. And our statistics are much, much better, but you have to learn how to deal with those moments. And I try to talk to them and say, hey, it's happened to me. It's happened to everybody. And you have to learn how to move on from it. And you have to think about as we spoke about, what's the process? What can I do better next time? How can I make sure this never, ever, ever happens again? And did I do my very best? And if you gave it your very best, there's not much more you can do than that, except for learning from your mistakes. If you don't learn from your mistakes, you're almost not honoring the patient and the problems that they have afterwards. And sometimes, I think about that, about when I think about things that have gone wrong, I'm like, but you know what? I learned such a valuable lesson that helped me with every subsequent patient, that particular thing never happened again, or I made sure to make it better in the future, which gives meaning to failure in a way. is the ability to learn from those failures.
Yeah, and I wanted to close with one passage I found really fascinating in the book, and it's a really well written book, so I definitely would recommend folks out there pick it up. But you had written something: operations are like voyages into unknown parts of the natural world, exposing sights rarely seen by other human beings, even other neurosurgeons. And that whole idea of discovery, I found really interesting, because you would think, hey, we've got the anatomy, we've been studying anatomy, it is what it is, we're not going to learn anything new. But maybe you could share, Ted, a little bit about that discovery. I know in the book you talk about comparing skull-based surgeons with rock climbers like Alex Honnold, who free soloed Yosemite's 3,000 foot El Capitan. Maybe share with me a little bit about that discovery mindset, because again, you're in a field where you've been doing this for a while, you're one of the best in the world at it, but yet you still have that discovery type of mindset because of what you're doing. Any thoughts on that discovery piece from your standpoint?
Yeah, when I was a kid, I wanted to be an astronaut. That was my dream. I was born in 1965. My earliest memory was the moon landing in 1969. I remember my parents woke me up. I think it was 11 o'clock, at night. I was probably been asleep for a couple hours. I was 4 years old to see these grainy images of Neil Armstrong on the moon. And I loved the idea of, voyaging into space and traveling. I watched a lot of Star Trek. I was, a little bit of a nerd that way. And the idea of going places that very few people get to go and seeing things that few people get to see and discovering new amazing sights. And when I first walked into a neurosurgical operating room, I saw these neurosurgeons who, as I mentioned before, are sitting in these chairs that bolster their arms wrapped around them with their hands in front of them, looking into these giant machines that are these microscopes. And I felt like they were in the cockpit of a starship, surrounded by technology. And they were voyaging into this place, which was the microcosm of the human brain, and seeing things that human beings are not meant to see. We're not meant to look into the human brain. Most people don't get to see into the depths of the brain. And, we think of the brain as the surface of the brain. If I ask you to imagine the brain, you see the surface of the brain, right? The gyri, that sort of pattern of bumps and lumps. But there's an enormous amount of anatomy that's in the depth of the brain, that's deep in the brain, that you only get to see if you dissect carefully in a living human brain for, an hour or two under a microscope. And suddenly it's almost like you're spelunking, and you walk through a little area and then suddenly you're in a giant cavern,
Right.
like Land of the Lost. And there's like waterfalls and dinosaurs, right? That's what neurosurgery is like. Like, we dissect through these narrow corridors, and then you kind of spread something and you're like, oh my God, I'm in the third ventricle. Like, I'm seeing this anatomy that I've read about in books, but I never knew what it actually looked like. And now I'm seeing it. And yeah, then there's the tumor. So let's take the tumor out. But you're sort of also looking around and saying, oh my gosh, this is incredible. This anatomy is beautiful. It's gorgeous. And that excitement never leaves you. Every operation we do, I feel in awe of the human brain and the anatomy of the human brain and what I get to see, and the privilege that I get to see these things every time. And neurosurgeons, we think of it as beautiful, and we publish images all the time. Like, if you go on Instagram, and everyone's showing pictures of their neurosurgical operations, like they're showing you their summer vacation, their pictures from the Grand Canyon, because we're showing off these incredible sights that we saw in the middle of the human brain. The only people who really appreciate them are other neurosurgeons, and we're kind of showing it off for our colleagues. But that's how we feel when we're in there.
Yeah, love it. And I think, again, for business leaders out there, just keep Ted's words in your mind. This idea that we should be in awe of the people that we're serving, the customers that we're serving, the employees that we're serving. It is a privilege. I think they use the word privilege. It's a privilege. We're not doing what Ted's doing, obviously, but in some small way, we are making a contribution. So I would encourage you to listen to Ted's words again, especially in that area of discovery. So, Ted, I'd be grateful if we can close our conversation today with 6 questions we call the strategic 6. Does that work for you?
It works. Let's do it.
All right, let's do it. Number 1, what was your first job?
Scooping ice cream at Haagen-Dazs.
All right, great. Number 2, what's your favorite vacation spot?
Wherever my wife tells me to go and my kids are, that ends up being my favorite spot.
Gotcha. Excellent. Number 3, what's the one word that best describes you?
Dependable.
Okay. Yep, I would definitely gauge that from our conversation. Number 4, what's one book that's had a significant impact on your development?
All right, I'm going to get a little esoteric here.
Okay.
I was a philosophy and English major, and I read this book by Paul Churchland called Scientific Realism and the Plasticity of Mind. And it is about, the reality, the scientific reality of the external world and how our minds create our internal representation of the external world. And it really got me thinking about how the brain really works.
Oh, okay. Great. Thank you. And number 5, what's the one piece of advice you'd most like to share with others that would fit on a bumper sticker?
Learn how to focus.
Yes, really important. And then last one, number 6, what's the most exhilarating moment you've experienced in your professional life?
The truth is, every time I leave the operating room after a successful operation, and I walk into the recovery room and I see the family and I let them know that everything went great, that moment, that feeling is like, heroin for me. And that's what keeps me going. There's no one most exhilarating. It is exhilarating every time. And I hope I can keep doing it for as long as possible.
Wonderful. Well, Ted, thanks a lot for sharing a lot of great tips, tools, techniques that you've used in your world. And I think as business leaders, a lot of us can borrow many of the principles, especially around decision making and risk mitigation and the things that you shared around discovery and innovation. So thank you very much. We'll put a link in the show notes to your incredibly interesting new book, Gray Matters, a biography of brain surgery, which offers a lot of valuable insights for leaders in all different fields. So again, highly recommend that. And Ted, thanks again for being a guest on the show today.
Rich, thanks for having me. It was really fun.
What are we talking about? Practice?
Practice makes perfect. Practice makes
Profit.
How well do you know your competition? As I facilitated the strategic thinking and planning process for companies over the past 20 years to develop their strategic plans, a comment that typically comes up halfway through the session is, wow, we've been in this business for 30 years, but there's a lot we don't know about the competition that we should. If that's the case, you may consider using, from a practice perspective, the competitive landscape. The competitive landscape asks you to assess your competition in 7 areas. Number 1, customer. Who do they target? Number 2, messages. What do they say? Number 3, capabilities. What do they have? What are their core assets and resources? Number 4, activities. What do they do with the resources that they have in order to successfully compete? Number 5, offerings. What do they provide to the customers? Number 6, results. How do they do when you compare yourself with them on some of the key metrics? And finally, number 7, strategy. How would you sum up their approach to winning business in the market in one sentence that might fit on a bumper sticker? So the competitive landscape is a great way to practice being strategic, because we always want to understand at a more granular level, what's the competition doing to be successful? And then we want to elevate our thinking to the higher level to understand what's their strategy or approach.
I appreciate your strategic mind.
Must have a strategic brain.
Great strategic minds of tomorrow right here.
In this segment, The League of Strategic Minds, I answer questions submitted by listeners. Today's question: what's the best way to communicate strategy? I recommend 3 proprietary tools I've designed to help people communicate strategy to their teams, to their leadership, and to their board of directors. Number 1, the Activity System Map. This is a great 1-page visual where we have 3 to 5 large spheres that represent our strategic themes, those key areas that are going to put resources in order to differentiate ourselves versus the competition. And then off of those 3 to 5 large circles, we have spokes with small activities or tactics that surround those, like satellites. That's a great way to communicate strategy across from a visual standpoint. The second tool I'd recommend is the GHOST framework. GHOST is an acronym for Goals, Objectives, Strategies, Tactics. Goals and objectives are what you're trying to achieve, strategy and tactics, how you're going to do it. And I would recommend you have no more than 3 to 5 goals, objectives, strategies, and tactics that you're working on at any one time. And finally, the third tool is a strategy print, which is a 2-page blueprint for your business. Page 1 captures your insights around market, competition, customers, and company. And page 2 is your strategic action plan. If you have a question you'd like answered, visit the Strategic Minds page on the website strategyskills.com and complete the brief submission form. If your question is selected, you'll receive some strategic swag for your contribution.
Any insights?
You play to win the game.
Any further insights?
You don't play to just play it.
Insightful.
I want winners.
I played the game to win.
I want people that want to win.
It's very insightful.
To close today's show, our Winsight, or idea for advantage, comes from Sarah Blakely, self-made billionaire and CEO of Spanx. Her comment, "Insights are gifts from the universe. Every time I have them, I capture them right away. The more that you write them down and pay attention to them, the stronger that the gift and the connection will become." Where are you recording your insights, and how often are you reviewing these insights to transform them into new value? If your team needs a new process and tools for strategic thinking, lacks a common language for strategy, is too reactive and tactical, or would like to increase innovation to grow profits and create competitive advantage, visit strategyskills.com, where you can learn more about strategy workshops, online certificate courses, the Strategic Thinker newsletter, and hundreds of other resources. Pick up a copy of my newly released book, Strategic, and take your leadership development to the next level by subscribing to the Strategic Fitness System, an innovative, state-of-the-art executive development platform. Remember, be strategic to be your best.